On a rainy afternoon, Ethan Carter, a successful hotel entrepreneur, walked into a small cafe tucked away in the corner of a busy street. Dressed in simple clothes, he looked like any other customer, but in reality, he was there on a mission. Ethan had built his career on providing exceptional service and creating welcoming spaces, but recently, complaints about one of his cafe locations had reached his ears. Determined to uncover the truth, he decided to go undercover and experience the cafe as a regular customer. The cafe had a rustic charm, but it was clear that it lacked care. The tables were slightly misaligned, and the floor could use a good sweep. Ethan scanned the room, taking in the details, when a warm voice interrupted his thoughts. "Good afternoon. Welcome to the Corner Cafe. Can I get you a table by the window?" Ethan looked up to see Sophie Bennett, a young waitress with a kind smile that seemed to brighten the gloomy day. Despite the obvious busyness of the cafe, Sophie carried herself with grace and professionalism. She led him to a table, handed him a menu, and quickly moved on to assist other customers. As Ethan sat there, he couldn't help but notice Sophie's tireless efforts. She moved swiftly between tables, balancing trays and taking orders, all while maintaining a friendly demeanor. It was clear she was overworked, yet she made every customer feel valued. Ethan's curiosity was piqued. Who was this woman who seemed to hold the cafe together despite its flaws? He decided then and there that he would return to learn more, not just about the cafe, but about Sophie, the waitress who had already left an impression on him. Ethan returned to the Corner Cafe the very next day, this time with a sharper focus. He wasn't just there to observe the cafe's operations, he wanted to understand Sophie Bennett, the young waitress who had caught his attention. Sophie was 27 years old, a single mother raising two adorable twin girls, Lily and Mia, who were just 4 years old. Life hadn't been kind to her. She had once dreamed of a stable family life, but those dreams were shattered when her boyfriend left her as soon as he found out she was pregnant. Left to fend for herself, Sophie had no choice but to work tirelessly to provide for her daughters. Every morning, Sophie would wake up before dawn, prepare breakfast for her girls, and drop them off at a nearby daycare before rushing to the cafe. The pay wasn't great, but it was enough to keep a roof over their heads and food on the table. Despite the challenges, Sophie never let her struggles show. She greeted every customer with the same warm smile, as if their happiness was her personal mission. Ethan watched her closely during his visits. He noticed how Sophie treated every customer like they were the most important person in the room. Whether it was a regular who always ordered the same coffee or a new customer unsure of what to get, Sophie made them feel welcome. Her kindness was genuine, but it wasn't just her attitude that impressed Ethan, it was her resilience. The cafe was understaffed, and Sophie often had to pick up the slack. She would juggle multiple tables, handle complaints with grace, and even to help the kitchen when things got hectic. Yet no matter how busy she was, she always found time to check on her customers, asking if they needed anything else or if their meals were to their liking. One afternoon, Ethan witnessed a particularly telling moment. A customer at a nearby table began complaining loudly about their coffee being too cold. The complaint was baseless. The coffee had just been served. But Sophie handled it with remarkable composure. "I'm so sorry about that," she said with a calm and professional tone. "Let me get you a fresh cup right away." She didn't argue or show any frustration. Instead, she returned with a new cup of coffee and a sincere apology, which seemed to diffuse the situation. Ethan was amazed. It wasn't easy to stay composed in such situations, but Sophie made it look effortless. As the days went by, Ethan's admiration for Sophie grew. He began to see her not just as a hard-working waitress, but as a symbol of resilience and kindness in a world that often seemed indifferent. She wasn't just doing a job, she was creating a small haven of warmth and care within the cafe. Ethan also started to notice the cracks in the cafe's management. The manager, Greg, was a stern and demanding man who seemed more interested in pleasing high-pay customers than supporting his staff. He would bark orders at Sophie, criticize her for minor mistakes, and never once acknowledge her hard work. One evening, as the cafe was winding down, Ethan overheard Greg scolding Sophie for something trivial. "Sophie? The VIP table said their water glasses weren't refilled fast enough. You need to be quicker," Greg snapped, his tone dripping with disdain. "I'm sorry, Greg. I'll make sure it doesn't happen again," Sophie replied, her voice steady but her eyes betraying her exhaustion. Ethan clenched his fists under the table. It was clear to him that Greg was the root of the cafe's problems. While Sophie was doing everything she could to keep the place running smoothly, Greg's lack of leadership and constant criticism were dragging everyone down. That night, as Ethan left the cafe, he couldn't shake the image of Sophie's tired but determined face. He knew he had to do something not just for the cafe, but for Sophie. She deserved better than this. Ethan began to visit the cafe more frequently, each time observing Sophie's interactions with customers and her ability to handle even the most difficult situations. He started to see her as the heart of the cafe, the one person who kept it alive despite the challenges. One day, as Sophie brought him his coffee, Ethan decided to strike up a conversation. "You're really good at what you do," he said, looking up at her with genuine admiration. Sophie smiled, though there was a hint of weariness in her eyes. "Thank you. I just try to do my best every day." "Do you ever think about doing something more? Like running your own place?" Ethan asked, curious about her dreams. Sophie hesitated, her smile fading slightly. "I've thought about it, but it feels impossible. I have my girls to think about, and honestly, just managing things here is hard enough." Ethan leaned forward, his voice soft but firm. "You have a gift, Sophie. The way you make people feel welcome. It's rare. You could do so much more if you had the chance." Sophie looked at him, her expression a mix of surprise and doubt. "That's kind of you to say, but I don't think I have what it takes. I'm just a waitress." "You're not just anything," Ethan replied. "You're the reason people keep coming back here. You have something special, and I think you could do great things." For a moment, Sophie's face brightened as if Ethan's words had sparked a small glimmer of hope. But then reality seemed to set in, and she shook her head. "Dreaming is nice, but it doesn't pay the bills," she said with a soft laugh, trying to brush off the conversation. Ethan didn't push further, but he made a silent promise to himself. He would find a way to help Sophie see her own potential and to create a better environment for her and the rest of the staff. As he left the cafe that day, Ethan felt more determined than ever. Sophie wasn't just a waitress, she was a fighter, a mother, and a beacon of hope in a place that desperately needed it. And he wasn't going to let her struggles go unnoticed. Ethan arrived at the corner cafe on a particularly busy afternoon. The place was packed, with customers occupying nearly every table. Sophie was rushing back and forth, balancing trays and taking orders, her usual warm smile still intact despite the chaos. Ethan could see the strain on her face, but she never let it show to the customers. From his usual seat near the window, Ethan observed the cafe's operations. The kitchen was clearly overwhelmed, and the staff was struggling to keep up. Yet Greg, the manager, was nowhere to be seen. Ethan frowned. It was obvious that Sophie was carrying the weight of the cafe on her shoulders, while Greg, the person who should have been leading, was absent from the action. After a while, Greg finally emerged from the back office, his expression as stern as ever. He scanned the room, his eyes narrowing as he spotted Sophie. Without hesitation, he marched over to her, his voice loud enough for nearby customers to hear. "Sophie, the VIP table is complaining again. They said their drinks took too long. What's going on?" Greg barked, his tone sharp and accusatory. Sophie paused, balancing a tray of plates. "I'm sorry, Greg. The kitchen is backed up, and I've been trying to keep up with all the orders. I'll make sure they're taken care of right away." Greg crossed his arms, his expression unimpressed. "Your best isn't good enough. Do you know how important those customers are? They're the reason this place stays open. If you can't handle it, maybe you should find another job." The words hit Sophie like a slap. Ethan could see the hurt in her eyes, though she tried to stay composed. "Yes, sir, I'll do my best," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. Ethan felt a surge of anger rise within him. He couldn't sit by and watch Greg humiliate Sophie any longer. Standing up from his table, he called out, his voice firm and loud enough to cut through the tension. "Greg, that's enough." The entire cafe fell silent. Customers and staff alike turned to look at Ethan, their expressions a mix of surprise and curiosity. Greg spun around, his face contorted with irritation. "And who are you to tell me how to run my cafe?" Greg asked, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Ethan took a step forward, his gaze steady. "Just a customer. But I can't sit here and watch you treat your staff like this. Sophie works harder than anyone here, and she deserves respect, not insults." Sophie's eyes widened in shock. She hadn't expected anyone, let alone a customer, to stand up for her. "You don't have to do this," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Ethan shook his head. "Sorry, Sophie, but I can't stay quiet about this." Greg let out a bitter laugh. "Listen, buddy, this is my cafe, and I run it how I see fit. If you don't like it, you're free to leave. But Sophie needs to learn to prioritize the customers who matter." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Do you really think a person's worth is measured by how much money they spend? If you can't respect your staff, then you're the one who needs to reevaluate." Greg's face turned red with anger. "If you have a problem, you're welcome to leave and not come back. We don't need customers meddling in our business." Ethan took a deep breath, trying to keep his composure. "I might leave, but not without saying this. You're the reason this cafe is struggling. Your staff is overworked and underappreciated, and it's because of your poor leadership. One day you'll have to face the consequences of that." Greg opened his mouth to respond, but Ethan didn't give him the chance. He turned to Sophie, his voice softening. "Sophie, don't let him make you feel like you're not enough. Your dedication and kindness are what keep this place running." Sophie looked at Ethan, her eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and concern. "Thank you," she said quietly, though her voice was tinged with worry. Greg, however, wasn't done. "That's enough. If you don't leave right now, I'll call security," he snapped, his voice rising. Ethan met Greg's glare with a calm but determined expression. "Go ahead, call security. But know this, you're the one driving this cafe into the ground, not Sophie." The tension in the room was palpable. Customers whispered among themselves and the staff exchanged nervous glances. Sophie, visibly shaken, placed a hand on Ethan's arm. "Please, don't argue for me. It's not worth it," she said, her voice pleading. Ethan turned to her, his expression softening. "It is worth it, Sophie. You deserve better than this." Greg, clearly losing his patience, pointed toward the door. "Get out. Now." Ethan hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Fine, I'll leave. But this isn't over." As he walked toward the door, he glanced back at Sophie. "Remember what I said. You're worth so much more than this." Sophie watched him leave, her heart heavy with conflicting emotions. She was grateful for Ethan's support, but she also feared the repercussions of his actions. Greg was not the kind of man to let things go easily, and she worried about what might happen next. After Ethan left, the cafe slowly returned to its usual rhythm, but the atmosphere was different. The staff seemed more tense, and Sophie couldn't shake the feeling of unease. She knew that standing up to Greg was the right thing to do, but it had also put her in a difficult position. That night, as Sophie walked home, her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. Ethan's words had struck a chord with her. For the first time in a long time, someone had seen her worth and stood up for her. It was a feeling she wasn't used to, and it left her both hopeful and uncertain. Meanwhile, Ethan was already planning his next move. He couldn't let Greg's behavior continue, and he couldn't let Sophie's hard work go unrecognized. It was time to take action, and this time, he wouldn't hold back. The next morning, Sophie arrived at the corner cafe feeling a mix of anxiety and exhaustion. The confrontation between Ethan and Greg the day before had left her shaken. She couldn't stop replaying Ethan's words in her mind. "You're worth so much more than this." As she tied her apron and prepared for another long shift, she noticed something unusual. Greg was pacing back and forth near the entrance, his face red with frustration. The staff whispered among themselves, exchanging nervous glances. Something was clearly going on, but no one seemed to know what. About an hour into the shift, the cafe doors swung open, and in walked Ethan. But this time he wasn't dressed in his usual casual attire. He wore a sharp suit, his confident demeanor commanding attention. Sophie froze mid-step, her heart racing. What was he doing here? Greg immediately stormed over to Ethan, his voice loud and confrontational. "What are you doing back here? I told you yesterday you weren't welcome." Ethan didn't flinch. Instead, he calmly reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. He handed it to Greg, who snatched it with a scowl. As Greg read the card, his expression shifted from anger to confusion and then to shock. "You, of Carter Hospitality Group?" Greg stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. The cafe fell silent. The staff and customers alike turned their attention to Ethan, their faces filled with surprise. Sophie stood frozen behind the counter, her mind struggling to process what she had just heard. Ethan nodded, his tone firm but composed. "That's right. I own this cafe, along with every other location in the chain. I've been coming here undercover to see what's really going on." Greg's face turned pale. I didn't know. I mean, if I had known." Ethan held up a hand, cutting him off. "That's exactly the problem, Greg. You shouldn't need to know who I am to treat your staff and customers with respect. I've seen enough during my visits to know that this cafe is failing not because of the hard-working employees, but because of your poor leadership." Greg opened his mouth to respond, but Ethan didn't give him the chance. "Effective immediately, you're fired. Pack your things and leave." The cafe erupted into whispers and gasps. Greg stood there, stunned, his face a mix of anger and humiliation. "You can't do this," he sputtered. "I can, and I just did," Ethan replied, his voice unwavering. "Now leave, before I have security escort you out." Realizing he had no choice, Greg stormed out of the cafe, slamming the door behind him. The room remained silent for a moment, the tension hanging in the air. Then Ethan turned to the staff, his expression softening. "I want to apologize to all of you," he said, addressing the employees. "You've been working under difficult conditions, and that's on me. I should have stepped in sooner. But starting today, things are going to change." The staff exchanged hopeful glances, their relief evident. Sophie, however, remained rooted in place, her mind racing. She couldn't believe what she had just witnessed. Ethan, the kind customer who had stood up for her, was actually the owner of the cafe. Ethan's gaze finally landed on Sophie, and he walked over to her. "Sophie," he said gently, "can we talk for a moment?" She nodded, still too stunned to speak. He led her to a quiet corner of the cafe, away from the curious eyes of the staff and customers. "I owe you an explanation," Ethan began, his tone sincere. "I've been visiting this cafe undercover because I wanted to see things for myself. I've received complaints about the management here, and I needed to understand what was really happening." Sophie finally found her voice. "So, all this time you knew? About Greg? About everything?" Ethan nodded. "Yes, and I saw how hard you work, how much you care about this place and the people who come here. You've been holding this cafe together, Sophie, and I can't thank you enough for that." Sophie looked down, her cheeks flushing. "I was just doing my job." "No," Ethan said firmly. "You've been doing so much more than that. You've been going above and beyond, even when you weren't treated fairly. That's why I want to offer you something." Sophie's eyes widened. "Offer me what?" Ethan took a deep breath. "I want you to take over as the manager of this cafe. You know this place better than anyone, and I believe you have what it takes to turn it around." Sophie stared at him, her mind reeling. "Me? A manager? I don't know if I can do that. I've never managed anything before." Ethan smiled, his expression encouraging. "You've been managing this cafe in your own way for a long time, Sophie. You just didn't have the title. I'll provide all the training and support you need, but I know you can do this." Tears welled up in Sophie's eyes. She had spent so long doubting herself, so long believing she was just a waitress. But here was Ethan, someone who had seen her worth and believed in her potential. I don't know what to say," she whispered. "Say yes," Ethan replied with a gentle smile. "You deserve this, Sophie, and I know you'll do an amazing job." After a moment of hesitation, Sophie nodded, a small smile breaking through her tears. "Okay, I'll do it." Ethan's smile widened. "That's the Sophie I've come to admire? I know you won't let me down." As the staff gathered around to congratulate Sophie, the atmosphere in the cafe shifted. For the first time in a long time, there was a sense of hope and excitement. Sophie felt a weight lift off her shoulders, replaced by a newfound sense of purpose. Ethan stayed for the rest of the day, working with the staff to address their concerns and outline the changes he planned to implement. By the time the cafe closed that evening, it already felt like a different place. As Sophie locked up for the night, she glanced at Ethan, who was waiting by the door. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." Ethan shook his head. "Don't thank me yet. The real work starts tomorrow." Sophie smiled, a spark of determination in her eyes. For the first time in years, she felt like she was finally moving forward, not just for herself, but for her daughters. The days that followed were a whirlwind of change at the corner cafe. With Greg gone, the atmosphere immediately improved. The staff felt more motivated, and customers began to notice the difference. Sophie, now the new manager, threw herself into her new role with determination. She worked closely with Ethan to implement changes that would make the cafe a better place for both employees and customers. At first, Sophie was nervous about her new responsibilities. She doubted herself, worried that she might not live up to Ethan's expectations. But Ethan was always there, offering guidance and encouragement. He spent hours at the cafe, not just as the owner but as a mentor and, increasingly, as a friend. One evening, after the cafe had closed for the day, Sophie and Ethan sat together at one of the tables, going over the day's sales and discussing plans for the future. The cafe was quiet, the only sound coming from the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. "You're doing an amazing job, Sophie," Ethan said, looking up from the papers in front of him. Sophie smiled, though she still felt a bit shy under his gaze. "Thank you, but I couldn't have done it without your help." Ethan shook his head. "You've always had it in you. I just gave you the opportunity to show it." There was a moment of silence as Sophie looked down at her hands, her thoughts drifting. "You know," she began softly, "I never thought I'd be in a position like this. For so long, I just survived. I never let myself dream about anything more." Ethan leaned forward, his voice gentle. "Why not?" Sophie hesitated, then shrugged. "I guess I didn't think I deserved it. After everything that happened with my ex, I felt like I had to focus on my girls and forget about myself. They're my whole world, and I'd do anything for them. But somewhere along the way, I stopped believing I could have more." Ethan's expression softened. "Sophie, you deserve so much more than just surviving. You're one of the strongest, most compassionate people I've ever met, and you've already proven that you're capable of incredible things." Sophie looked up at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You really believe that?" "I do," Ethan said firmly, "and I'll keep reminding you of it until you believe it too." Their eyes met, and for a moment, the world seemed to fade away. Sophie felt her heart skip a beat, and she quickly looked away, her cheeks flushing. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Over the next few weeks, their bond grew stronger. Ethan continued to spend time at the cafe, not just to oversee the changes, but because he genuinely enjoyed being there. He and Sophie often found themselves talking late into the evening, sharing stories about their lives. Ethan told her about his journey to success, how he had started with nothing and built his hospitality empire from the ground up. Sophie, in turn, opened up about her struggles as a single mother, the sacrifices she had made, and the dreams she had buried long ago. One evening, as they were locking up the cafe, Ethan turned to Sophie. "Can I take you out to dinner sometime?" he asked, his voice hesitant but hopeful. Sophie blinked, caught off guard. "Dinner?" Ethan smiled, a hint of nervousness in his expression. Yeah, just the two of us. No cafe talk, no work, just a chance to get to know each other better." Sophie hesitated, her mind racing. She hadn't been on a date in years, and the idea of letting someone into her life, especially someone like Ethan, was both exciting and terrifying. I don't know," she said finally. "I mean, I have the girls and—" Ethan interrupted her gently. "I know your daughters come first, and I wouldn't want it any other way, but you deserve to take some time for yourself too. Just think about it, okay?" Sophie nodded, her heart pounding. "Okay, I'll think about it." A few days later, Sophie found herself saying yes. Ethan took her to a cozy little restaurant on the edge of town, far away from the hustle and bustle of the cafe. The evening was filled with laughter and easy conversation, and for the first time in a long time, Sophie felt like she could let her guard down. As they walked back to her apartment that night, Ethan turned to her. "Sophie, I know this might be too soon, but I want you to know how much I admire you. You're an incredible woman, and I feel lucky just to know you." Sophie stopped in her tracks, her breath catching in her throat. "Ethan, He held up a hand, his expression gentle. "You don't have to say anything. I just wanted you to know how I feel." Sophie looked at him, her heart full of emotions she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything, for believing in me, for standing up for me, for being you." Ethan smiled, and for a moment they simply stood there, the world around them fading into the background. From that night on, their relationship began to blossom. It wasn't always easy. Sophie was cautious and Ethan was patient, understanding that she needed time. But little by little, they grew closer, their connection deepening with each passing day. For Sophie, it was more than just a romance. It was a chance to believe in herself again, to see that she was capable of love and happiness. And for Ethan, it was a reminder of what truly mattered in life. Not success or wealth, but the people who made it all worthwhile. Months passed, and the corner cafe had transformed into a thriving, welcoming space. Under Sophie's leadership, the staff felt valued and motivated, and customers began to notice the difference. The cafe was no longer just a place to grab a quick coffee. It had become a community hub, filled with warmth and positivity. Sophie had grown into her role as manager with confidence. She implemented new ideas, improved the menu, and even organized small events like open mic nights and charity drives. The cafe's success wasn't just about the numbers, it was about the people. Sophie had created an environment where both employees and customers felt like they belonged. Ethan continued to visit the cafe regularly, though now his visits were less about business and more about spending time with Sophie. Their relationship had blossomed into something beautiful, built on mutual respect, admiration, and a deep connection. One sunny afternoon, Ethan arrived at the cafe with a surprise. He walked in, carrying a small bouquet of flowers, and made his way to Sophie, who was busy helping a customer. "Sophie," he said, his voice warm and full of affection. She turned to him, her face lighting up with a smile. "Ethan, what are you doing here in the middle of the day?" "I have something to show you," he said, holding out the flowers. Sophie blushed as she took the bouquet. "These are beautiful, thank you, but what's the occasion?" Ethan grinned. "You'll see, come with me." Curious, Sophie followed him outside, where a sleek black car was waiting. Ethan opened the door for her and they drove off, leaving the cafe in the capable hands of the staff. After a short drive, they arrived at a small, charming building with a "for sale" sign in the window. Sophie looked at Ethan, confused. "What is this?" she asked. Ethan smiled, his eyes sparkling with excitement. "This is your future." Sophie's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" Ethan turned to her, his expression serious but full of hope. "You've done an incredible job at the cafe, Sophie. You've proven that you're not just a great manager, you're a visionary. I want to help you take the next step. This place is for you. I want you to have your own cafe, your own business, where you can create something that's entirely yours." Sophie stared at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Ethan, I can't accept this. It's too much." "It's not too much," Ethan said gently. "You've earned this, Sophie, and I'll be here to support you every step of the way. This isn't just a gift. It's an investment in you, because I believe in you." Tears welled up in Sophie's eyes as she looked at the building, imagining what it could become. For so long she had buried her dreams, convinced that they were out of reach. But now, standing here with Ethan, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice trembling. Ethan smiled. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." Sophie took a deep breath, her mind racing with possibilities. Finally, she nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. "Okay, let's do it." Ethan pulled her into a hug, his arms wrapping around her tightly. "I'm so proud of you, Sophie. This is just the beginning." A year later, Sophie's new cafe, Lily and Mia's, named after her daughters, had become a local favorite. The space was bright and inviting, filled with the same warmth and care that Sophie had always brought to her work. Customers loved the personal touches, from the handwritten notes on the menu to the small play area for children. Sophie's daughters, Lily and Mia, often spent time at the cafe, their laughter filling the air as they played in the corner. For Sophie, it was a dream come true, not just because she had her own business, but because she had created a life where her daughters could thrive. Ethan was by her side every step of the way. Though he was busy with his own business ventures, he always made time for Sophie and the girls. Their relationship had grown stronger, built on a foundation of love, trust, and shared dreams. One evening, after the cafe had closed for the day, Ethan surprised Sophie with a small celebration. The staff, along with a few close friends, gathered to toast the cafe's success. As the evening wound down, Ethan stood up, holding a glass of champagne. "I just want to say how proud I am of Sophie," he began, his voice filled with emotion. "She's not just an incredible manager or a talented businesswoman. She's an amazing mother, a wonderful partner, and the most inspiring person I've ever met. Sophie, you've shown all of us what it means to dream big and work hard, and I can't wait to see what you do next." Sophie blushed, tears glistening in her eyes as everyone raised their glasses in her honor. Later that night, as they walked home together, Ethan stopped and turned to Sophie. "There's one more thing I've been meaning to ask you," he said, reaching into his pocket. Sophie's breath caught as he pulled out a small velvet box and opened it to reveal a sparkling ring. "Sophie Bennett, will you marry me?" Tears streamed down Sophie's face as she nodded, her voice breaking. Yes, I will." Ethan slipped the ring onto her finger, and they embraced under the soft glow of the streetlights. For Sophie, it was the start of a new chapter, one filled with love, hope, and endless possibilities. The story ends with a shot of Sophie, Ethan, and the girls standing in front of Lily and Mia's, their smiles radiating happiness. It was a reminder that with hard work, kindness, and a little bit of faith, even the most impossible dreams could come true. Thank you so much for watching this heartwarming story here on Emma's Stories. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales like this one. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What did you think about Sophie's journey? Let us know in the comments below. And remember, life is full of challenges, but with kindness, determination, and a little bit of hope, anything is possible. Stay tuned for more amazing stories, and we'll see you in the next video on Emma's Stories. Take care and stay inspired.